Ever feel like life is just ordinary? The daily grind, the familiar faces, the predictable routines? We all do. But what if I told you that sometimes, just sometimes, the most mundane events can shatter that predictability in the most unimaginable way? Today, we're diving into a story that proves just that. A story about loss, about family secrets, and about a twist so shocking, it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the people around you. Get ready to have your perception of reality subtly altered. Because sometimes, the biggest surprises whisper their way into our lives when we least expect them. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and wilting lilies. It was the kind of day that seemed to mirror the collective grief, a low, persistent drizzle that blurred the edges of everything, making the world feel muted and indistinct. We stood huddled beneath a sea of black umbrellas, a small island of sorrow in the vast, indifferent landscape of the cemetery. My hand instinctively tightened around Mark's arm, a silent offering of comfort, though I knew my own heart felt like a lead weight in my chest. Arthur. My father-in-law. Gone. He hadn't been a demonstrative man, Arthur. Quiet, reserved even. Our relationship had always been polite, respectful, but never truly close. He was Mark's father, and for that, I had always held him in a certain regard. We'd shared holidays, milestones, the quiet rhythm of family life. Now, that rhythm was broken, a beat skipped, leaving a hollow echo in its place. Looking around at the small gathering, I saw the familiar faces of Mark's siblings, their spouses, a few distant relatives I barely knew. Their expressions ranged from genuine sadness to a kind of weary resignation. Death, after all, is a universal experience, a shared human burden. Yet, in its intimacy, it feels profoundly personal, a unique tear in the fabric of our individual lives. Mark stood beside me, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the freshly turned earth. I could feel the tension in his arm, the barely suppressed emotion that rippled through him. Losing a parent, no matter the complexity of the relationship, leaves an undeniable void. The minister's words, a comforting blend of scripture and personal anecdotes, drifted over us, carried on the damp breeze. I tried to focus, to find some solace in the familiar rituals of farewell, but my mind kept drifting. I thought about the last time I'd seen Arthur, just a few weeks ago, looking frail but still possessing that quiet strength that had always defined him. We'd shared a cup of tea, a few polite words about the weather and the garden. Nothing profound, nothing that hinted at the seismic shift that was about to occur. What are your go-to coping mechanisms during times of grief? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The day after the funeral was a blur of hushed phone calls and logistical arrangements. The immediate family gathered again, this time not in the solemn silence of a cemetery, but in the slightly stuffy, oak-paneled office of Arthur's lawyer, Mr. Henderson. The air inside was thick with a different kind of tension now, a nervous anticipation that hummed beneath the surface of our polite condolences. Mr. Henderson, a man whose demeanor exuded quiet competence, sat behind a large mahogany desk, a stack of official-looking documents neatly arranged before him. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to speak in a low, measured tone. He recounted Arthur's life, his achievements, the values he held dear. It was a respectful preamble, a final tribute to the man we had just laid to rest. Then came the part we were all, perhaps subconsciously, waiting for, the reading of the will. Mr. Henderson's voice remained steady as he detailed various bequests. Small sums left to distant relatives, charitable donations, specific items of sentimental value passed down to Arthur's children. I listened attentively, my mind already picturing the antique watch Mark had always admired going to his older brother, the set of porcelain dolls his sister had cherished as a child. It all felt normal, expected. And then, Mr. Henderson said something that made the air in the room seem to thicken even further, something that caused a ripple of unease to spread through the assembled family. He announced that the bulk of Arthur's estate, A significant portion, he emphasized, would be left to a single beneficiary, me. My head snapped up. I looked at Mark, whose face mirrored my own shock and utter disbelief. Around the room, I saw a kaleidoscope of expressions: confusion, surprise, and something that looked suspiciously like resentment beginning to flicker in the eyes of Mark's siblings. Mr. Henderson continued, his voice unwavering, stating the figure. $450 million. The number hung in the air, a colossal, unimaginable sum that seemed to defy reality. It felt like a punch to the gut, stealing the breath from my lungs. My mind struggled to process the information, to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man we had just buried with this staggering fortune. Have you ever received unexpected news that completely changed your perspective? How did you react? Share your experience in the comments. The initial shock gave way to a disorienting sense of unreality. It felt like we were living in a movie, a poorly written melodrama where plot twists were thrown in for dramatic effect. $450 million. The words echoed in my mind, a relentless, deafening mantra. Mark and I left Mr. Henderson's office in a daze, the bewildered faces of his siblings burned into my memory. The drizzle had stopped, and a weak afternoon sun was trying to break through the clouds, casting long, distorted shadows. The world outside seemed to have continued its normal rhythm, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in our lives. We walked in silence for a while, the weight of the news pressing down on us. Finally, Mark turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and something else I couldn't quite decipher. "Sarah, what just happened?" I shook my head, unable to articulate the chaos swirling within me. I don't know, Mark. I have no idea. Our financial situation before this had been comfortable, but certainly not extravagant. We both worked hard, lived within our means, and had diligently saved for the future. We owned our modest home, had a reliable car, and could afford the occasional vacation. We were the epitome of middle-class stability. This inheritance was so far beyond anything we could have ever imagined, it felt alien, almost threatening. Over the next few days, the reality of the situation began to sink in, slowly and inexorably. The sheer scale of the fortune was overwhelming. It wasn't just a life-changing amount of money, it was a world-altering sum, capable of buying islands, funding revolutions, shaping destinies. And it was mine. Or rather, it was now ours. The implications were staggering. We could pay off our mortgage, our car loans, every single debt we had ever accumulated, with barely a dent in the principal. We could travel the world, pursue passions we had always put on hold, secure our future and the future of any children we might have. The possibilities seemed endless, almost paralyzing in their scope. If you suddenly received a large sum of money, what would be the first thing you would do? Let's hear your initial reactions in the comments. A week later, we were back in Mr. Henderson's office, this time for a more detailed explanation of Arthur's will. Mark's siblings were present again, their initial shock having seemingly morphed into a simmering resentment that was palpable in the room. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions and thinly veiled suspicion. Mr. Henderson patiently went through the document, explaining the intricacies of Arthur's estate. It turned out that Arthur had been an incredibly astute businessman, having built a vast and diversified portfolio of investments over his lifetime. He had kept his wealth largely private, a secret even from his own children. As Mr. Henderson delved deeper into the specifics of the will, a clearer picture began to emerge, and with it, a fresh wave of bewilderment washed over me. Arthur hadn't just left me the money outright. The will stipulated that the inheritance was to be held in a trust, with specific conditions and stipulations attached. The primary condition was that I, and only I, was to be the sole beneficiary and trustee of this enormous fortune. Mark and his siblings were explicitly excluded from having any direct access to or control over the funds. This revelation landed like a bombshell, the silence in the room broken only by the rustling of papers as Mr. Henderson continued to read. The will outlined Arthur's reasoning, though it offered more questions than answers. He stated that he had observed my character over the years and believed that I possessed the integrity and level-headedness necessary to manage such a significant amount of wealth responsibly. He expressed concerns about his children's financial habits and their potential to squander the inheritance. I glanced at Mark, whose face was a mask of stunned disbelief. His siblings were openly exchanging bewildered and angry glances. The air crackled with unspoken accusations and hurt feelings. Mr. Henderson explained that the trust was structured to provide me with a substantial annual income, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. It also allowed for certain discretionary distributions for specific purposes, subject to the approval of the trust's legal counsel. The implications of this arrangement were profound and deeply unsettling. Arthur's will had not only bestowed upon me an unimaginable fortune but had also created a significant rift within Mark's family, placing me squarely at the center of it. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt caught in the middle of a family conflict? How did you navigate it? Share your strategies in the comments. The days that followed the second meeting with Mr. Henderson were fraught with an unspoken tension in our home. Mark was quiet, withdrawn, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a brooding silence that hung heavy in the air between us. I tried to talk to him, to understand what he was feeling, but he would simply shrug and offer vague reassurances. "It's just a lot to process, Sarah," he'd say, his eyes avoiding mine. I knew it was more than just processing. His father had left his entire fortune to his daughter-in-law, effectively bypassing his own children. It was a deeply personal rejection, a public declaration of his lack of faith in their ability to handle such wealth. I couldn't imagine how devastating that must feel. Our dynamic shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, but the change was undeniable. There was a new distance between us, a coolness that hadn't been there before. I felt like an outsider in my own home, an intruder who had inadvertently come between Mark and his family. I tried to empathize with his siblings, to understand their anger and resentment. From their perspective, it must have seemed incredibly unfair. They had grown up with Arthur, shared their lives with him, and now, a relative newcomer, his son's wife, was the sole inheritor of his vast fortune. The weight of the inheritance, which had initially felt like a fantastical dream, now felt like a crushing burden. It had not brought us joy or freedom, instead, it had brought division and discord. I found myself constantly replaying conversations with Arthur in my mind, searching for any clue, any hint that might explain his decision. Had he disliked his children more than I realized? Had he seen something in me that they lacked? Or was there some other, more complex reason behind his seemingly inexplicable choice? The silence from Mark continued, punctuated by strained smiles and forced pleasantries. I longed for the open communication we had always shared, for him to confide in me, to let me understand his feelings. But he remained closed off, lost in his own thoughts, leaving me to navigate this unexpected storm alone. Have you ever experienced a significant change in your relationship dynamic due to external circumstances? How did you and your partner navigate it? Share your insights in the comments. The simmering resentment from Mark's siblings finally boiled over at a tense family dinner a few weeks later. The occasion was ostensibly a belated memorial for Arthur, but the underlying tension was thicker than the gravy on the table. Mark's older brother, David, a man known for his bluntness, was the first to break the strained silence. "So, Sarah," he began, his tone deceptively casual, "how are you planning on handling all that money?" I felt my cheeks flush. I had been dreading this conversation. "Honestly, David, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all. Mr. Henderson is helping me understand the terms of the trust. A trust that conveniently excludes your husband and his own family, Mark's sister, Emily, interjected, her voice sharp with accusation. Don't you think that's a little odd? Emily, Mark began, his voice low and warning. No, Mark, let her answer, David cut him off. We all want to know what's going on here. Did Dad say anything to you, Sarah? Anything at all about why he made this unusual decision? I looked from David to Emily, their faces etched with suspicion and hurt. I felt a surge of sympathy for them, but also a growing sense of defensiveness. Arthur didn't discuss his will with me, David. This was just as much a shock to me as it was to all of you. But he trusted you, Emily pressed, her voice laced with disbelief. He trusted you more than his own children. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. I didn't know how to respond. How could I explain a decision that I myself didn't understand? The argument escalated quickly, fueled by years of unspoken sibling dynamics and the raw emotion of grief mixed with financial anxiety. Accusations were thrown, old grievances resurfaced, and the carefully constructed facade of family harmony shattered into a million pieces. Mark remained largely silent throughout the ordeal, his face pale and drawn. I could see the pain in his eyes, torn between his loyalty to his family and his relationship with me. By the end of the evening, the family was fractured, the bonds that had once held them together strained to the breaking point. Mark and I left the dinner feeling emotionally drained and isolated, the weight of the inheritance heavier than ever. Have you ever witnessed a family conflict erupt over money or inheritance? What were the dynamics at play? Share your observations in the comments. As the initial shock and family drama began to subside, I started to delve deeper into the specifics of Arthur's will and the trust he had established. Mr. Henderson was incredibly helpful, patiently explaining the legal complexities and answering my endless questions. The trust was indeed substantial, providing a more than generous annual income and allowing for significant discretionary distributions for things like healthcare, education, and charitable giving. However, there were also several specific conditions attached, conditions that raised even more questions about Arthur's motivations. One condition stipulated that I was required to maintain ownership of Arthur's sprawling estate, a large, somewhat dilapidated property on the outskirts of town that none of his children had ever expressed any interest in. The upkeep alone was exorbitant, and the house itself held a strange, almost melancholic atmosphere. Another condition stated that I was to personally oversee the care of Arthur's aging dog, a grumpy old terrier named Winston, who had a penchant for biting strangers and shedding copious amounts of hair. While I didn't dislike dogs, Winston was particularly challenging. But the most perplexing condition of all was a clause that required me to visit Arthur's grave at least once a month and leave a specific type of flower, a single white rose, on his headstone. It seemed like a strange, almost sentimental request from a man who had always been so reserved and unemotional. As I learned more about these conditions, I couldn't help but feel like I was a pawn in some elaborate game, a game orchestrated by a man I hadn't truly known. Why these specific conditions? What was the significance of the old estate, the grumpy dog, the single white rose? I tried to discuss these questions with Mark, hoping he might have some insight into his father's eccentricities. But he remained distant, his responses short and non-committal. The inheritance had created a wall between us, a barrier of unspoken resentment and unresolved grief. I found myself increasingly isolated, burdened by a secret fortune I hadn't asked for and a set of responsibilities I didn't fully understand. The dream of financial freedom had quickly turned into a complex web of obligations and unanswered questions. Have you ever inherited something that came with unexpected obligations or responsibilities? How did you handle them? Share your experiences in the comments. Months turned into a year. I dutifully fulfilled the conditions of the trust, visiting Arthur's grave each month with a single white rose, tolerating Winston's grumpy demeanor, and attempting to manage the upkeep of the sprawling estate. The house felt cold and empty, filled with the ghosts of Arthur's past. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the dusty attic, I stumbled upon a locked wooden chest tucked away in a dark corner. Curiosity piqued, I searched the house for a key, eventually finding a small, tarnished one hidden inside an old book in Arthur's study. With trembling hands, I unlocked the chest and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed letters and faded photographs, was a collection of old journals bound in worn leather. They were Arthur's diaries, spanning decades of his life. I carefully picked up the top journal, its pages brittle with age, and began to read. Arthur's reserved exterior melted away as I delved into his private thoughts and reflections. He wrote about his childhood, his early business ventures, his hopes and dreams, his joys and sorrows. As I continued reading, a picture of a much more complex and vulnerable man began to emerge. He wrote with surprising tenderness about his late wife, Mark's mother, and the profound grief he felt after her death. He also wrote about his regrets, particularly regarding his relationship with his children, whom he felt he had failed in some way. Then, I came across an entry that made my heart skip a beat. It was dated a few years before his death, and in it, Arthur wrote about observing me, about being impressed by my kindness, my integrity, and my unwavering support for Mark. He expressed a deep-seated fear that his children were not equipped to handle his wealth responsibly and that it would ultimately lead to their unhappiness. He wrote that he had decided to leave the bulk of his estate to me, not because he loved his children any less, but because he believed I would be a responsible steward of his legacy and that I would ultimately use the funds in a way that would benefit the entire family, even if they didn't understand his decision at the time. Have you ever discovered a secret about someone you thought you knew well? How did it change your perception of them? Share your experience in the comments. Arthur's journals provided a window into his heart and mind, revealing the complex motivations behind his seemingly inexplicable decision. I finally understood that his will wasn't an act of malice or favoritism, but rather a deeply personal and perhaps misguided attempt to protect his family in the way he thought best. The weight of the inheritance shifted slightly. It was no longer just a random windfall, but a responsibility, a trust placed in me by a man who had, in his own way, come to believe in me. I shared my discovery with Mark, showing him the entries in his father's journals. As he read his father's words, a range of emotions flickered across his face: sadness, surprise, and perhaps a flicker of understanding. It didn't magically erase the hurt and resentment that had built up over the past year, but it did begin to open a path towards healing. We started to talk more openly, sharing our feelings and acknowledging the complexities of the situation. Mark admitted that he had felt betrayed and inadequate when he learned about the will. Reading his father's words helped him understand that it wasn't a reflection of his worth, but rather a testament to his father's anxieties and his belief in my character. The relationship with Mark's siblings remained strained, but there was a subtle shift in their interactions with me. The raw anger had softened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. They, too, had heard about the discovery of the journals and were slowly beginning to process the information. The inheritance was still a significant factor in our lives, a constant reminder of the unexpected turn our path had taken. But now, it felt less like a burden and more like a complex challenge, one that we would have to navigate together as a family. Have you ever had a difficult conversation that ultimately led to a better understanding with someone you care about? What made the difference? Share your insights in the comments. The $450 million inheritance didn't bring us a fairy tale ending. There were no sudden reconciliations with Mark's siblings, no dramatic changes in our personalities. The money remained a complex and often uncomfortable presence in our lives. We used a portion of the funds to establish a foundation in Arthur's name, supporting causes he had cared about. We also helped Mark's siblings financially, though the gestures were met with a mixture of gratitude and lingering resentment. The old estate remained in my name, a constant reminder of Arthur's eccentricities. I continued to visit his grave each month with a single white rose, a quiet ritual that had become a strange sort of connection to the man I had never truly known. Winston, the grumpy terrier, continued to rule the roost, a furry, four-legged symbol of the unexpected responsibilities that had come with the inheritance. Mark and I learned to navigate our new reality, the weight of the fortune shaping our decisions and our relationship in ways we could never have anticipated. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding of the complexities of family, legacy, and the unpredictable nature of life. The money had given us security, opportunities, and a level of comfort we had never known before. But it had also brought its own set of challenges, testing our relationships and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths. Our future remained unwritten, a path stretching out before us filled with both possibilities and uncertainties. The inheritance was a part of our story now, an indelible mark on our lives. It wasn't a happy ending, not in the traditional sense. But it was our ending, a testament to the enduring power of family, the complexities of human relationships, and the surprising twists that life can sometimes take. What are your thoughts on the complexities of inheritance and family dynamics? Share your reflections in the comments below. Thank you for listening. So, what do you make of Sarah's journey? A life irrevocably changed by a whisper from the past. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What unexpected whispers might be lurking in the corners of your own life? What secrets might be waiting to be uncovered? If you enjoy stories that delve into the complexities of human nature and leave you pondering long after they've ended, then you found your place here at WhispersStory. Tap that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss another captivating tale that will stir your emotions and challenge your perceptions. We love hearing your thoughts, so share your reactions and interpretations of this story in the comments below. Until next time, keep listening closely. You never know what whispers might be coming your way.